I have never believed that small moments can reveal who people truly are. But that night, buried under choking snow and flickering streetlights, a single parked car exposed something ugly, something dangerous, something that refused to let me walk away quietly. Because rage does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives calm and heavy, settling into your chest like ice water, waiting for you to move. And before I take you any further, tell me something honestly. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it there? And are you alone, or surrounded by people who have no idea what kind of story you are about to hear? Because this is not just about snow or a blocked parking lot. This is about the moment when patience finally snaps, the kind of snap that feels loud inside your head, even if the world stays silent. The kind of snap that forces you to choose between swallowing anger or letting it take shape in your hands. And that evening began like every other exhausting winter evening, with my boots soaked, my fingers numb, and the parking lot of our apartment complex looking like a battlefield where everyone had fought only for themselves and then vanished, leaving behind crooked tire tracks and half-buried cars like abandoned promises. The management had not plowed the snow, not once, not even a token attempt, so every resident became their own rescuer, their own laborer, their own enemy. And earlier that morning I had already dug my girlfriend's car out once, shoveling until my shoulders burned, watching her drive away while I stood there breathing hard, thinking the worst was over. But winter never asks permission before taking more from you. And by evening the snow had returned heavier, wetter, angrier, forcing us to dig again from a completely different spot. The sky had that dull orange glow that cities wear at night, the kind that makes snow look dirty and endless. And while we worked, neither of us spoke much, because exhaustion does that. It strips conversation down to survival, shovel, lift, throw, repeat, until finally the car lurched free with a groan that felt almost human, and for a brief second relief washed over me. That fragile relief that makes you believe the universe might give you one small mercy. But mercy is fragile, and as we crept toward the exit of the lot, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the snow, my heart sank in a way that felt immediate and physical. Because right there, blocking the only exit like a deliberate insult, sat a car parked sideways, careless, selfish, unmoved by the chaos around it, as if the driver had decided their convenience mattered more than the freedom of everyone else. I remember staring at it, hoping my eyes were lying to me, hoping there was some hidden gap I had missed, but no, the exit was sealed, a dead end built by pure indifference, and something inside me tightened, not exploded yet, just tightened, like a wire pulled too far. I honked once, then again, longer this time, the sound echoing uselessly against apartment walls, swallowed by falling snow. No movement, no flicker of lights, no apology emerging from the darkness. So I got out of the car, boots crunching loudly, and shouted into the night, "Whose car is this?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, sharper than I expected, edged with disbelief. Still nothing. Windows remained dark, the snow kept falling like it was mocking me, and I felt that pressure rise. The pressure of being trapped not just physically but emotionally, because there is something uniquely infuriating about being blocked after you have already spent all your energy just trying to leave. I called the apartment maintenance company with fingers that barely worked, my breath fogging the phone screen, explaining the situation, expecting urgency, expecting someone to care, but the voice on the other end sounded bored, distant, promising to send someone out as if they were scheduling a dentist appointment, not responding to a situation where dozens of residents were effectively locked in. And when the call ended, the anger finally began to move. It shifted from my chest into my arms, my legs, my thoughts. I looked around at the lot, at the snowbanks piled like walls, and decided if the exit was blocked, then I would carve another way. Not because it made sense, but because doing nothing felt unbearable. I grabbed the shovel again and started digging to adjacent parking spaces, my movements fast and aggressive, snow flying everywhere. My girlfriend sat in the car watching. I could feel her concern even without seeing her face, because she knows me. She knows I avoid conflict. She knows I apologize when other people bump into me, and yet there I was, hacking away at frozen ground like it had personally wronged me. And then it happened, that moment that changed everything. The shovel cut into a dense, perfect clump of snow, heavy, solid, satisfying in a way that felt almost dangerous. And without fully deciding to, without pausing to debate morality or consequences, I turned toward the car blocking the exit and dumped that clump directly onto its windshield. The sound was dull, final, like punctuation, and for half a second the world felt still, as if it was waiting to see what kind of person I really was. And I did not know then whether the driver had been sitting inside the car the entire time, watching, or whether he returned at the exact wrong moment. But suddenly, a door flew open, and a man jumped out, his voice slicing through the cold. "What are you doing?" His words were sharp, offended, like he was the victim here, and I froze for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but in disbelief, because of all the things he could have said. All the apologies he could have offered. He chose outrage. and something in me snapped cleanly then. Not messy, not chaotic, but clear. Like glass breaking along a perfect line. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the wind, and I yelled, louder than I ever remember yelling at a stranger. "You are blocking the only exit. Move your car." My voice echoed across the lot, raw and unfiltered. And in that moment, standing there with a shovel in my hands and snow at my feet, I realized this was no longer about a parking space. It was about boundaries, about accountability, about the line between being peaceful and being invisible. And as the man stared back at me, stunned, the snow kept falling, covering footprints, erasing evidence, and I did not know yet how far this moment would travel, or how deeply it would stay with me. But I knew one thing for certain: this night was not going to end quietly. The man stood there for a moment, staring at me like he was trying to decide whether I was worth the trouble. His breath visible in short, aggressive bursts, his jacket half-zipped as if he had rushed out without thinking. And for a split second the entire situation balanced on a knife edge, because I could feel it, that silent calculation men do when pride clashes with inconvenience, the kind of calculation that sometimes turns small conflicts into headlines. My grip tightened on the shovel without me consciously deciding to, not because I wanted to use it, but because my body was preparing for a possibility my mind refused to name. And in that frozen second I noticed details that felt absurdly sharp. The way snow clung to his beard, the way his tires were angled lazily like he never expected anyone to challenge him, the way his eyes flicked toward my girlfriend's car behind me, measuring witnesses, measuring consequences. And then his expression shifted, not into remorse, but into annoyance, as if I had interrupted something important. He brushed the snow off his windshield with exaggerated movements, slapping at it angrily, muttering under his breath, and I realized he still did not understand. Not really, because people like that rarely do. They see obstacles, not people, inconveniences, not responsibility. And as he worked, my anger did not fade the way I expected it to. It sharpened into something colder, something quieter, because now it was clear this was not ignorance, this was entitlement. And the more calmly he acted, the more furious it made me, because calm, in the face of shared struggle, is often cruelty disguised as confidence. I took a step back, lowering the shovel slightly, not because I was backing down, but because I wanted him to move. That was the goal, not a fight, not a scene, just freedom. And finally, he climbed back into the car, slammed the door, and for a heartbeat I wondered if he would just sit there again, out of spite. But the engine started, headlights flared, and he pulled forward, tires grinding through snow, clearing the exit like it had never mattered. Like all of this had been an unnecessary interruption to his night. And as he drove past me, he did not look at me, not once, which felt like its own kind of insult, like refusing to acknowledge the damage you caused makes it disappear. And then he was gone, taillights fading into the snowy dark, leaving behind nothing but churned ice and the echo of adrenaline buzzing through my veins. I stood there longer than I needed to, heart racing, lungs burning, trying to convince my body that the danger had passed. And only when my girlfriend called my name softly did I realize how tense I had been. I turned toward her, suddenly aware of how ridiculous I must have looked, standing in the snow, holding a shovel like a weapon, and shame crept in fast and unwelcome. Because that is what always comes after anger for people like me. The guilt of stepping outside the version of yourself you carefully maintain. I walked back to the car, snow crunching under my boots, my hands starting to shake now that the moment was over. And as we drove out through the newly cleared exit, relief washed over me again, heavier this time, tangled with doubt, because while part of me felt justified, another part replayed the confrontation over and over, imagining how easily it could have gone wrong, how one bad decision, one extra word, could have escalated everything. The drive home was quiet, the heater humming, windshield wipers scraping rhythmically, and I kept seeing his face in my mind, that flash of outrage, that refusal to accept fault, and it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because I recognized something familiar in it, not in myself, but in people I had known my whole life, people who move through shared spaces as if they are private property, people who count on others being too polite, too tired, too afraid to push back. And when we finally got home, the warmth of the apartment felt unreal, like stepping into a different world. Coats hung up, boots left by the door, snow melting into small guilty puddles, and I sat down harder than I meant to, exhaustion hitting all at once. My girlfriend asked if I was okay, her voice careful, and I nodded automatically, but the truth was messier, because peacekeeping comes with a cost, and stepping outside it feels like breaking a rule you were taught without ever remembering who taught it to you. Later that night, as the adrenaline faded, I found myself feeling bad, not for dumping snow on his car, but for yelling, for losing control, for becoming someone loud and confrontational, because that version of me felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. And yet, beneath the guilt, there was something else, something I could not quite name at first, a quiet satisfaction, not in humiliating him, but in refusing to be trapped by someone else's carelessness, in choosing action over silent resentment, and that realization disturbed me, because it suggested that my usual calm was not always kindness. Sometimes it was avoidance, sometimes it was surrender disguised as virtue. And as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind batter the building, I wondered how many times I had swallowed moments like this before, how many exits I had let others block because I did not want to make noise, and I wondered what it meant that tonight, it took snow and exhaustion and one selfish decision to finally push me past that line. Because once you cross it, even briefly, you can never fully pretend it does not exist, and somewhere out there, the man who blocked the exit probably told the story differently, probably painted himself as the victim of an unhinged neighbor, probably forgot the entire thing by morning, while I lay awake replaying every second, weighing my actions, questioning my identity, realizing that petty revenge is never just about revenge, it is a mirror. And sometimes the reflection stays with you far longer than the moment itself. Sleep did not come easily that night, not because of fear, but because my mind kept circling the same questions like a moth trapped in a dim room, bumping into walls it could not see, and every time I closed my eyes, the scene replayed with cruel clarity. The shovel cutting into snow, the dull thud against the windshield, the way his voice cracked the air, and beneath those images ran a quieter current, an uncomfortable truth about myself that I had avoided for years, because I had always told myself I was calm, reasonable, someone who chose peace over conflict. But lying there in the dark, I began to wonder if that story had been convenient rather than honest. If my avoidance had been mistaken for virtue simply because it kept things easy for others. The storm outside continued well into the early hours, wind rattling the windows like a warning. And when morning finally arrived, it brought with it a dull gray light and streets buried deeper than before. The city looked exhausted, bowed under the weight of neglect, and as I stepped outside to head to work, shovel in hand again, the parking lot greeted me like a battlefield frozen in time. The exit clear now, but marked by tire grooves and churned ice that told the story of last night in scars, rather than words. Neighbors moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, everyone locked in their own private wars against the snow, and I felt strangely exposed, as if the confrontation had stripped away an invisible layer of insulation I usually relied on. Every sound felt louder, every glance heavier, and yet no one said anything, because moments like that live only in the people who experience them. To everyone else, it was just another winter morning. I dug my own car out this time, the physical labor grounding me, each scoop of snow an attempt to bury the lingering tension. But even as my muscles burned, my thoughts drifted back to the man, to the casual way he had parked, to the confidence with which he had assumed no one would challenge him, and a question lodged itself in my mind, not angrily, but persistently. How many times had he done that before? How many exits had he blocked in life, literal or otherwise, without ever being forced to move? The thought followed me through the day, through emails and meetings, through small talk that felt hollow, and I caught myself watching people more closely, noticing the subtle ways entitlement shows itself. The coworker who interrupts without apology, the driver who cuts in line and refuses to make eye contact, the neighbor who leaves trash just outside the bin because someone else will handle it. And I realized how often these small acts go unchallenged, not because they are acceptable, but because confrontation carries risk, and most of us are tired enough to let things slide, tired enough to dig our own way around obstacles instead of demanding they be removed. And that night, when I returned home, the snow had hardened into ice, glittering deceptively under the streetlights, and as I parked, a familiar shape caught my eye at the far end of the lot. The same car, unmistakable, tucked into a space as if nothing had happened, as if last night had been erased, and my chest tightened again, not with anger this time, but with something closer to resolve, because seeing it there confirmed what I had suspected, that for him, the incident had not been a lesson, just a brief inconvenience. And that realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Change rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens when patterns are disrupted repeatedly, when consequences refuse to stay isolated, and I found myself wondering whether my outburst had been enough, whether it had actually shifted anything, or whether it had simply allowed him to continue as before. Slightly more cautious perhaps, but unchanged. The thought unsettled me more than the confrontation itself, because it suggested that righteousness without follow-through is just noise. And as I walked past his car, I slowed, noticing details I had missed before. The worn tires, the small dent on the bumper, the parking permit hanging crookedly from the mirror, signs of someone who lived here, someone who shared this space, and yet treated it as his own. And in that moment, I felt the urge to do something again, not out of spite, but out of principle, to make the lesson stick. But another part of me pulled back, reminding me of how close the situation had come to violence, how easily things can spiral. And I stood there longer than I should have, caught between action and restraint, the same old conflict wearing a new face. Eventually I walked away, but the decision did not bring relief. it brought tension, because now the choice felt conscious, deliberate, and therefore heavier. Over the next few days, the snow lingered, melting during the day and refreezing at night, turning the lot into a patchwork of hazards, and small conflicts flared everywhere, raised voices over parking spots, notes left on windshields, passive-aggressive gestures piling up like drifts, and I watched it all with a new awareness, understanding how quickly stress strips away civility, how thin the line is between order and chaos when systems fail. And in that environment, the man became a kind of symbol to me, not as an individual, but as an embodiment of a larger problem, the assumption that someone else will accommodate you, that rules are flexible when you are the one bending them. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply that mindset is woven into daily life, how often it goes unpunished, rewarded even. And one evening, as I returned home later than usual, headlights sweeping across the lot, I saw it happen again, not as dramatically, but just as telling, his car idling near the exit, angled lazily, not fully blocking it, but close enough to force other drivers to squeeze by carefully, claiming space without technically breaking the rule, a familiar tactic. And I watched as another resident hesitated, then maneuvered awkwardly around him without a word, choosing inconvenience over confrontation. And something inside me settled then, not into anger, but into clarity, because I understood that the first confrontation had not been about him at all. It had been about me recognizing a pattern I had tolerated too long, and as I parked and stepped out into the cold, I knew that whatever came next, it would not be impulsive, it would not be loud, it would be intentional, because sometimes the most effective response to entitlement is not rage, but persistence. And the night air felt sharper as I walked toward the building, my mind already mapping possibilities. Not for revenge in the dramatic sense, but for accountability, the kind that forces people to acknowledge the space they occupy, whether they want to or not. The next morning arrived with a brittle kind of cold that made every sound feel amplified, doors slamming like gunshots, engines groaning in protest. And as I looked out over the parking lot from our window, coffee cooling untouched in my hands, I saw his car again, parked close to the exit, not blocking it outright, but asserting presence the way people do when they believe rules exist for others. And instead of anger, what I felt surprised me. It was focus, the kind that settles in quietly and refuses to leave, because I had realized something important over the last few days. Confrontation had made him move once, but it had not changed his behavior. It had only taught him to toe the line, and that meant the problem was not solved, it was simply evolving. So I began to pay attention, not obsessively, but deliberately, noticing patterns the way you do when something finally clicks. I noticed the times he came and went, usually late, often impatient. I noticed how he parked crookedly, even when space allowed better alignment. How he treated shared areas like suggestions rather than agreements. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that this was not accidental. This was habit, entitlement reinforced by a lack of consequences. And something about that bothered me deeply. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I wanted the space to work. I wanted the rules to mean something. I wanted fairness to stop being optional. So I started small, documenting without announcing, taking note of dates, times, positions, snapping photos when the exit narrowed beyond what was reasonable, not with a sense of thrill, but with methodical calm, because quiet preparation carries a power that loud anger never does. And over the following week, the snow melted enough to reveal the underlying chaos of the lot, oil stains, cracked asphalt, faded lines that no one seemed to respect, and yet the exit remained sacred, the one rule everyone understood, except him. And each time he edged closer, testing boundaries, I felt less reactive and more resolved, because now I was not acting from emotion. I was responding to a pattern, and patterns can be addressed. One evening, as I returned from work, I saw a maintenance truck idling near the building, and an idea formed, not sudden, but inevitable, because systems fail most when people stop using them. So I approached the worker casually, asking about snow removal schedules, about parking enforcement, about who handled violations, my tone neutral, curious, and in response I learned something crucial. Towing only happened when management had clear documentation and repeated complaints, not angry calls, not isolated incidents, but proof, patterns, evidence. And as I thanked him and walked away, the plan crystallized fully, not as revenge, but as correction, because there is a difference. Revenge seeks satisfaction. Correction seeks change, and I wanted change. Over the next several days, I continued documenting each near block, each partial obstruction, each moment where someone else was forced to maneuver around his convenience, and slowly, quietly, I began submitting reports to management, attaching photos, dates, times, descriptions that spoke for themselves, no exaggeration, no insults, just facts. And I did this patiently, understanding that systems move slowly, but they move, especially when fed consistently. And all the while, he continued parking, as he always had, confident in his cleverness, confident in the absence of immediate pushback, unaware that the ground beneath his habits was shifting. The first sign came subtly, a printed notice taped near the mailboxes about keeping exits clear. General, Nan, accusatory, easy to ignore, and he did ignore it, parking the same way that evening, reinforcing my belief that entitlement often mistakes silence for approval. The second sign came a few days later, a warning slip tucked under his wiper, polite language, official logo, a reminder rather than a threat, and I watched from a distance as he found it, his shoulders stiffening, his head turning slowly as if searching for witnesses, confusion flickering across his face, and for the first time, he looked uncertain, not angry, just unsettled, because uncertainty is what entitlement fears most. But even then, he adjusted only slightly, pulling back just enough to claim compliance, still asserting presence, still forcing others to adapt. And that was when I knew patience would win, because systems respond to persistence, not resistance. The final incident happened on a night when freezing rain slicked the lot into a mirror, headlights reflecting dangerously, and once again, he parked too close, narrowing the exit into a hazard. And this time, someone else complained, not knowing about my reports, not knowing about the growing file bearing his habits, and that extra complaint tipped the balance. The call went out, the documentation aligned, and when I returned home later that evening, the space where his car usually sat was empty, not because he had moved it, but because it had been moved for him. Tire marks curved sharply toward the street, unmistakable signs of a tow, and standing there, I felt no rush of triumph, no laugh, no thrill, just a quiet release, like something knotted had finally loosened, because the exit was clear, completely clear, and for the first time since the storm, the lot felt functional. The next morning, his car returned, parked perfectly within the lines, far from the exit, compliant in a way it never had been before. And when I passed him on the stairs later that day, our eyes met briefly, his expression guarded, searching, and I held his gaze without hostility, without guilt, without apology, because this had never been personal. It had been procedural, and that was the real lesson. Not that anger gets results, but that consistency does. That calm action reshapes behavior more effectively than shouting ever could. And as I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in days. Not because I had one, but because the space we shared finally felt shared again. In the days that followed, something subtle but undeniable changed in the atmosphere of the parking lot. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way tension slowly drains from a place when order returns. Cars lined up more carefully, the exits stayed open, drivers hesitated less, and people moved with a little more consideration, as if an unspoken rule had finally been restored. And I realized then how much mental energy had been consumed by something so small, yet so persistent. Because shared spaces shape our behavior in ways we rarely acknowledge. They teach us whether we matter, whether boundaries exist, whether consideration is optional or expected. And watching that exit remain clear felt like watching a wound heal, slowly but completely. One quiet night as I stood by the window looking down at the lot, snow now reduced to dirty piles at the edges, I thought about the man again, not with anger, not even with judgment, but with a strange kind of understanding. Because entitlement does not always come from malice, sometimes it grows from unchecked habits, from living too long without resistance. And while I had once felt guilty for yelling, for dumping snow, for breaking my own rules of calm, I now understood that moment as a catalyst, not the solution, but the spark that forced me to stop absorbing inconvenience as if it were my responsibility. The real change had not come from confrontation, it had come from follow-through, from refusing to let the issue dissolve into memory, from choosing consistency over catharsis. And that realization stayed with me long after the snow was gone, long after winter loosened its grip, because I began to notice the same pattern elsewhere in my life. The meetings where one voice dominated because no one challenged it, the friendships where effort flowed one way because silence allowed imbalance, the small daily compromises that accumulate until resentment feels inevitable. And I started making different choices, not louder ones, but firmer ones, choices that respected my own boundaries as much as I respected others. And what surprised me most was how often people adjusted when faced with calm persistence. How rarely conflict was actually required. It was as if many were simply waiting for the rules to be enforced, for expectations to be made visible, and even the man in the parking lot became part of that quiet shift. Weeks passed without incident. His car remained properly parked, his presence no longer disruptive, just another resident sharing space. And in that normalcy there was a lesson more powerful than any dramatic revenge fantasy. Because justice does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives with order, with balance restored so quietly that only those who lived through the chaos truly appreciate the peace. One evening, months later, as spring finally softened the city, I walked through the lot without thinking about exits or angles or entitlement, and that absence of thought felt like the greatest victory of all, not because someone had been punished, but because a problem had been resolved. because a boundary had been enforced without cruelty, because patience paired with action had done what anger alone could not. And standing there in the fading light, I understood something I wish I had learned earlier, that being peaceful does not mean being passive, that avoiding conflict is not the same as avoiding responsibility, and that sometimes the most meaningful form of revenge is not making someone feel small, but forcing them to finally respect the space they occupy. And if this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt trapped by someone else's carelessness or swallowed frustration to keep the peace, then take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more real stories like this, and comment your thoughts below, because your experience matters too.